A private named Robert Holmlund crawls onto the flat concrete roof of a German barracks, kicks the steel cover of a ventilator shaft, and shoves a Bangalore torpedo down into the room full of enemy soldiers below. The blast throws the garrison up the stairwell in the dark. Years later, a man who was near him remembered Holmlund grinning about it, saying he could hear them swearing and trampling over one another trying to get out. That was the 3rd of October 1944, on top of Fort Driant, 5 miles southwest of the French city of Metz. And it was the 4th attempt on a fort that had already thrown Patton's infantry back 3 times. Before it was over, this hill would hand George Patton the only ground defeat he ever admitted to in the whole war. Fort Driant still fell. The men who beat it did not do it with a bigger bomb or a cleaner charge across the top. They went down into the tunnels with satchel charges and flamethrowers. And the American weapon that finally cracked the Metz forts open was a self-propelled gun, the crews called the Doorknocker. It was a 155mm cannon that could punch through 7 feet of reinforced concrete. If you were one of the infantrymen sent up that slope in late September, none of that had happened yet. You knew only that the field guns behind the hill had been firing for days, and the fort had not so much as flinched. Fort Driant sat on high ground above a bend in the Moselle River, and it had been built to do exactly one job: stop an army from crossing there. The Germans did not capture this fort. They built it. When France lost the War of 1871, Metz and the land around it became German. Between 1899 and 1905, the German army raised a whole belt of forts across the Moselle Heights, a lock against any French attempt to take the region back. This one they called Feste Kronprinz, the Crown Prince's stronghold, part of the Kaiser's great fortress line guarding the Moselle. It was a dispersed strongpoint. Its armored batteries and barracks were spread out and dug in across the hilltop, so no single hit could take the whole thing. When France got the region back after the First World War, they renamed the fort for Colonel Émile Driant, an officer who fell at Verdun. So, in the autumn of 1944, the Germans holding Fort Driant were defending a fortress their own grandfathers had built, on ground the German army had spent 30 years learning how to hold. The fort was steel-reinforced concrete, and it ran about 700 yards deep from front to back. Around the whole outer edge ran a dry moat 60 feet across, and beyond the moat lay another 60 feet of barbed wire, woven so thick a man could not walk through it. Inside sat 5 main gun batteries, casemates holding 150mm and 100mm guns, protected by armored steel turrets that indirect fire simply bounced off. One of those turret assemblies, the Moselle battery, weighed about 78 tons with its mechanism. The dome alone weighed close to 15 tons. You do not knock a 15-ton steel dome off a hill by lobbing shells at it from behind cover. Then there was the part no aerial photograph showed. Under the surface, the fort was a warren. Pillboxes, observation posts, gun positions, and barracks were all stitched together by underground galleries and tunnels that ran for thousands of yards. A garrison could sit out a bombardment far below the roof, walk to a fresh firing position through a lit corridor, and come up shooting from a spot the Americans had thought was cleared an hour before. The Germans had stocked the place with food, water, and ammunition to last, and they could afford to wait. George Patton did not think this would take long. His Third Army had raced across France that summer, and Metz looked like one more town on the road to the German border. He handed the job to the 5th Infantry Division of Walton Walker's 20th Corps under Major General Stafford Irwin. The plan was to grab the high ground at Fort Driant so American guns could sit on top of it and dominate the whole southern approach to the city. He should have known better, and part of why he did not was that the Third Army had already stopped moving. The summer race ended at the Moselle, and it did not end because the Germans found some new line. It ended because Patton ran out of fuel. The advance had outrun its own supply. The gasoline that fed the tanks and trucks was rationed to a trickle, while the ports far behind the front stayed clogged. By the end of September, the United States Army's own history of the campaign says, Third Army operations came to an abrupt halt. Then the weather turned. Autumn of 1944 was one of the wettest on record in Lorraine. The Moselle came up over its banks, and the ground the tanks needed turned to a paste that swallowed boots to the ankle. Every day the Americans sat still. The German First Army dug the Metz forts in deeper and moved fresh troops into them. The window for a fast bound past the city had closed. What was left was the hard way, and the hard way started at Fort Driant. The first attack went in on the 27th of September at 2:15 in the afternoon. It opened the way American attacks were supposed to open. Squadrons of P-47 Thunderbolts came down first, dropping 1,000-pound bombs and tanks of napalm onto the roof of the fort. The bombs cracked and scorched the concrete. Underneath, they did almost nothing. Behind the airstrike, 2 rifle companies of the 11th Infantry Regiment, B and E, started up the open slope with tank destroyers of the 818th in support. There was no cover on the slope, none at all. The companies came into the open. The fort woke up. Machine guns firing from armored ports the artillery had not touched raked the ground. Guns from the neighboring forts in the Metz ring, which could all see this slope, added their fire to it. By 6:30 that same evening, the survivors were pulled back down, and they had not reached the moat. Then it came again. E Company had gone up the hill with about 140 men. It came off the hill having lost 35 of them, a quarter of its strength, in a single push. Within the first day of hard fighting, B and E companies between them had taken around 110 casualties, close to half the men committed. And they had done it without taking the fort. The riflemen who reached the wire found they could not cross the moat under that fire, and the ones who found a way over could not stay. The men on the hill started calling it the face of the moon. It was churned bare by shellfire, grey and cratered, with no tree and no wall to hide behind, and any American who moved on it in daylight was seen from 3 directions at once. This is the stretch the whole story turns on, so it is worth being honest about it. For most of 2 weeks, the most successful army in Western Europe, could not take one old fort with the tools it normally used. Field artillery could not reach the guns. Fighter bombers could not reach the garrison. Infantry could reach the top and could not hold it. So the engineers tried to change the ground itself. Bulldozers went forward to shove earth into the dry moat and build a ramp a tank could cross, working under fire in the open. The Germans shot at the blades. The Americans brought up what the men called snakes, long pipes packed with explosive that were meant to be pushed into the wire and the trench line and blown to clear a path. The snakes came apart or failed to do enough. The wire stayed. Every ordinary answer the American war machine carried had now been tried on Fort Driant, and the fort had beaten all of them. That is the point where the fighting went underground, and it is where the tools finally started to fit the target. Inside a tunnel, the flamethrower mattered in a way it never did anywhere else. The M2 flamethrower, a combat engineer carried on his back, held 2 small tanks of thickened fuel and 1 of nitrogen to push it. It reached only about 65 feet on a good burst, and it burned itself dry in roughly 7 seconds. On an open battlefield, those are terrible numbers. In a concrete corridor 8 feet wide, where the enemy is around the next corner and there is nowhere for either man to go, 65 feet is the whole world, and the flame does not need to hit a man to clear a room. It burns the air. A garrison that could sit under bombs all day could not sit in a gallery with fire coming down it. The satchel charge worked on the same logic. A canvas bag of explosive laid against a steel door or shoved through a firing slit did what a distant shell never could, because it was pressed flat against the thing it had to break. And behind both of those, the Americans finally brought forward a gun built to do the one job the fort had made impossible. The Doorknocker had almost not existed. Its gun was old, a 155mm piece the Americans had copied from a French design of the First World War. The idea of bolting it onto a tank chassis so it could roll up and fire point blank struck the army as a curiosity nobody had asked for. They built 100 of them anyway. Then they lost interest. For most of 1943, the vehicle sat mothballed or hauled trainees around stateside, and that October, the Army Ground Forces formally declared it did not want them. The invasion of Europe changed the verdict. Somebody remembered that a heavy gun you could aim straight at a bunker over open sights was exactly what a fortress war would need, and the mothballed Doorknockers were pulled back out and shipped to 6 armoured field artillery battalions. From the Normandy hedgerows to the German border, they turned out to be the best concrete breaker the Americans owned. The gun nobody wanted became the answer to the fort nobody could crack. The M12 gun motor carriage mounted a 155mm cannon on a tank chassis, so the crew could drive the heavy gun straight up to a target and fire over open sights instead of arcing shells from miles back. The troops called it the Doorknocker. Firing concrete-piercing shells, it could drive a hole through 7 feet of reinforced concrete from 2,000 yards away, and around the 10th of October, M12s were brought into the fight at Fort Driant to do exactly that to the casemate faces. A 95-pound shell arriving flat and hard on a gun port is a different proposition than the same shell falling out of the sky onto a steel dome built to shrug it off. On the 7th and 8th of October, the assault went into the tunnels for real. Companies of the 11th Infantry and Combat Engineers of the 7th Combat Engineer Battalion pushed down into the galleries with charges, grenades, and the flamethrowers, trying to reach the central core of the fort from inside. It was some of the strangest fighting of the entire war in the West, done by flashlight and muzzle flash in corridors that all looked alike, with the two sides sometimes a single sandbagged barricade apart. The surface above them was worse. October rain turned the churned ground of the hilltop to cold mud, and the men lived in it, unable to move by day and soaked through by night, resupplied only in the dark and never enough. The fort was many small fights at once. On the surface, the riflemen held slices of trench and the tops of two barracks, while artillery from the neighboring forts fell on them. Below, the engineers felt their way through the German galleries and learned to fear the side passages. When the Americans took a tunnel the Germans had used, they began pushing into it themselves. And at one point, the engineers talked seriously about digging their own shaft down into the fort rather than fighting through the doors the garrison had already barricaded. Reinforcements went up the hill in pieces. A company of the 2nd Infantry, a battalion of the 10th, fed in to relieve men who had been on the face of the moon too long. One old fort was eating the strength of a division, a rifle company at a time. Robert Holmlund's night was part of this push. On the 3rd of October, his B Company had forced its way into the fort area on the surface, and it was in that fight that he climbed the barracks and dropped the torpedo down the ventilator. He was promoted and decorated for it afterward, awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. He did not learn about it. Later that same night, moving among his men to check their positions during a German artillery barrage, Holmlund fell. The award was posthumous, and the man it honored never heard his own name read out. The tunnels took a specific kind of nerve. Sergeant Dale Clackamp of the 7th Combat Engineer Battalion was underground when German fire suddenly opened down a gallery his men were holding. According to the United States Army's own history of the Lorraine campaign, Clackamp sprang forward under that fire and began building a barricade of sandbags across the corridor. He threw up a wall by hand while rounds came down the tunnel. The position he built held long enough to save the soldiers behind it. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for it. The engineers learned to fight the fort the way the garrison did, corner by corner, wall by wall, in the dark. It was not enough, and this is where an honest account has to slow down. The Germans knew the tunnels better than any map could teach the attackers. Roving patrols came up out of galleries the Americans thought were sealed and caught engineers and riflemen from behind. Special flamethrower and demolition parties were caught in the open corridors and lost before they could reach the core. When the engineers hit one iron door deep inside, they found it backed by more than 20 feet of scrap metal, concrete, and wrecked machinery stacked to the ceiling. A 60-pound shaped charge, a beehive, blew only a small hole in the pile. The men cut at the rest with welding torches while the Germans fired through the gap they opened. The arithmetic finally decided it. Between the 3rd and the 8th of October, the attack lost 21 officers and 485 men in the fort. On the 9th, Patton authorized the fort to be given up. During the withdrawal, an explosion in one of the tunnels caught a group of men, took 4 of them, and left 23 badly gassed. On the night of the 12th into the 13th of October, the last Americans came off the hill. The whole battle for Fort Driant had cost the 5th Division around 64 men lost, 547 wounded, and 187 missing or captured, close to 800 casualties for a piece of ground they did not hold. Omar Bradley had told Patton to stop. The exchange survives in Bradley's own recollection, so it is a memory rather than a transcript, but the substance is on the record. "For God's sake, George, lay off," Bradley said. "Why bloody your nose in this pecking campaign?" Patton's answer was that he was using Metz to blood the new divisions, to harden green troops in a hard fight. It was, and Patton knew it, the only real ground defeat of his war. The frontal assault on the top of Driant failed. The method the Americans built during it did not. Patton stopped trying to storm the fort belt and decided to go around it. In early November, the Third Army left Driant, and the other forts sitting where they were crossed the Moselle elsewhere and drove straight for Metz itself. Within days, the city was surrounded and the German escape routes were cut. By the 22nd of November, Metz was in American hands, all except the ring of forts that still sat outside it with their guns intact. And now those forts were not a wall in front of an advancing army. They were islands, cut off from resupply, cut off from relief, with the war moving east past them and nothing coming to help. The German side had already done the math and chosen this ending. Adolf Hitler had ordered the Metz garrison to stand and be encircled rather than pull back, and the officer who had to make that order work, Generalleutnant Heinrich Kittel, knew he could not hold everything. So he concentrated what he had on the 4 strongest forts in the ring, Driant among them, along with Jeanne d'Arc, Platteville, and St. Quentin. On the night of the 14th of November, the last supply train from the east reached Metz, carrying a few weeks of rations and several dozen extra guns, and after that, nothing more would ever come. The men in those forts were now spending a fixed and shrinking store of food and shells, and every American knew it. The garrisons that manned the western arc of the belt came in part from the 462nd Volksgrenadier Division, and they were good troops behind good concrete. Concrete and courage do not. No fort in the ring could grow its own bread. So the Americans did the patient thing. Order that came down forbade a direct assault on the isolated forts. There was no sense spending lives and ammunition on walls that would fall on their own. The forts would be sealed off instead, and hunger would do the work the infantry could not. One by one, the forts gave up. Fort Verdun surrendered on the 26th of November. After it, the others began to follow, each garrison reaching the point where holding a fort no relief was coming, to change to nothing about the war outside it. That is the siege, the flame and the demolition charges and the door knockers were built for. one fort at a time. American infantry and engineers came back with the tools that had been refined on Driant's slope, and the direct-fire 155mm guns went to work on the casemate faces that indirect fire could never reach. The garrisons that had been unbreakable while an army was throwing itself at their walls were something else once the food ran low and no shell they fired changed anything outside. The forts began to give up. Fort Driant held out longest of almost all of them. Its garrison sat under the reduced ration and the mounting hopelessness through late November and into December, cut off, with the flame teams and the direct fire siege guns working the ring around them tighter. On the 8th of December 1944, at 3:45 in the afternoon, the fort that had beaten Patton's infantry back 3 times and turned back the underground assault ran up the white flag and surrendered to the 5th Infantry Division. It had never been carried by storm. It had been surrounded, starved, and worn down until holding it meant nothing. The last of the Metz forts, Fort Jeanne d'Arc on the Western Arc, held 5 days longer still and gave up on the 13th of December to the American Third Corps, the final German position in the whole fortress to lower its flag. Metz, a fortress city that had not fallen to a direct assault in living memory, belonged to the United States Army. So the reversal is real, and it is worth naming plainly. A fort built to be immune to everything the Americans normally carried made a fool of field artillery, of fighter bombers, and of a straight infantry charge for the better part of 2 weeks. The answer was not a heavier bomb. It was a change in how the Americans fought a fortress. It was the flamethrower that turned a defended tunnel into a place no garrison could hold. It was the satchel charge and the shaped charge pressed flat against steel and concrete. It was the M12 Doorknocker driving a shell through 7 feet of concrete over open sights, doing to a casemate face what no shell falling from the sky could do. And it was the siege that put all of those tools around a fort that could no longer be relieved. The men who worked that out paid the full price for the lesson on the face of the moon. Robert Holmlund, up on a barracks roof with a torpedo in his hands. Dale Clackamp, building a wall of sandbags in the dark with rounds coming down the corridor. 800 casualties from one division on a hill they walked away from in October and accepted the surrender of in December. Fort Driant beat Patton's men 3 times. The 4th try went underground with flame and charges, and though it did not take the fort that week, it was the method that reduced the whole Metz fort belt in the end, and the fort that had never been stormed surrendered all the same. If you served in an engineer battalion, or your father or grandfather carried a flamethrower or crewed a self-propelled gun in that campaign, leave what you know in the comments. The men who fought underground at Metz left far fewer stories than the men who fought in the open, and every one of them is worth having. And tell me which fortress you want next. The concrete belt at Cherbourg that 3 American battleships had to reach with their main guns, or the pillbox line of the West Wall that a single 155mm gun cracked open at point-blank range. Name it, and we will go into it.